The morning at JFK Airport was busy but familiar. Like so many others, passengers moved through the terminal with the quiet urgency of routine, some hurrying to gates, others lingering in cafes with coffee and newspapers. On Skywings Flight 724, the crew prepared for departure, their voices a soft murmur over the hum of engines. It was an ordinary day. Or so it seemed. Devin Grant boarded the plane, a man accustomed to the quiet observation of life's rhythms. At 44, he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. A civil rights attorney, he was no stranger to conflict. Yet he sought no trouble here. His week in New York had been demanding a series of conferences, meetings, and late nights drafting policy recommendations. Now, all he wanted was the simplicity of a westbound flight. A few hours to catch his breath and perhaps find some clarity in the endless expanse of the sky. Devin found his seat in business class, greeted by the familiar leather upholstery and the faint scent of cleaning supplies. He stowed his briefcase, settled in, and let his gaze drift out the window. Beyond the glass, baggage carts trundled by, and ground crews moved with efficiency, their fluorescent vests vivid against the concrete. He admired their diligence, a reminder that every role mattered, no matter how invisible it seemed to others. A flight attendant passed him, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Devin barely glanced up, though he caught a fleeting sense of hesitation as she passed. Her name tag read Kara, and she appeared to be in her late 30s, poised, composed, and every inch the professional. Yet something about her demeanor, a flicker of discomfort in her glance, lingered in the air between them like an unspoken question. Devin dismissed the thought and opened his laptop, immersing himself in a draft he had been revising. He found solace in words, the act of shaping thoughts into something tangible, something that might endure. Outside his window, the city gave way to clouds as the plane ascended. It wasn't until the beverage service began that the day's first oddity caught his attention. Kara approached his row with measured steps, her tray balanced with the precision of experience. When she reached Devin, she paused, then set the tray down on the folding table before him. "Coffee and water, sir?" Her tone was brisk, efficient, and without warmth. "Yes, thank you," Devin replied, offering a polite smile. Before she handed him the glass, Kara reached into her apron and pulled out a pair of rubber gloves. She slipped them on quickly, as though it were second nature, and then placed the coffee and water in front of him. Devin noticed her movements were careful, deliberate, almost exaggerated in their precision. For a moment, he said nothing. He didn't want to assume. Yet, as Kara moved on, he couldn't ignore what he had just witnessed. Looking down the aisle, he watched her serve the next passenger, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit without the gloves. Devin shifted in his seat, his focus drifting from his laptop to the small interaction he'd just witnessed. He had spent years studying the subtle ways prejudice could manifest, quiet, almost imperceptible, but no less impactful. Was this one of those moments? Or was it just a coincidence? A quirk of procedure? He told himself to let it go. After all, what would it change to make a scene now? Yet something in him stirred. A quiet but insistent voice reminding him that some things, no matter how small, couldn't go unacknowledged. The flight continued in its quiet routine. But Devin's thoughts remained unsettled. Around him, other passengers chatted softly or buried themselves in their own distractions. The sky outside was endless, a boundless expanse of white clouds and pale blue, as indifferent as ever to the lives of those who traveled beneath it. And yet, within the cabin, a quiet tension was growing, one that no one could name, but that everyone, on some level, could feel. The plane settled into a steady rhythm, its hum blending with the soft rustle of newspapers and the occasional murmur of conversation. The early rush of boarding had given way to an air of quiet, the kind that often accompanies long flights. Devin leaned back in his seat, the glow of his laptop illuminating his thoughtful expression. He tried to focus on his notes, but his mind kept circling back to the small detail that had caught his attention earlier. Kara moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, her face composed into a mask of professionalism. There was nothing overtly unusual about her manner. Yet Devon found himself watching her in the same way he might observe a legal case unfolding, aware of the subtle nuances. The moments that seemed to tell a story beyond the surface. When Kara returned to his row, her demeanor was polite but distant. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice even but lacking warmth. Devon studied her for a moment before replying. "No, thank you," he said. His tone was courteous, but the unspoken question lingered between them. He could feel it in the way her gaze shifted, just enough to avoid meeting his eyes. As Kara continued down the aisle, Devon found himself replaying the earlier moment in his mind. It wasn't the gloves themselves he understood the need for caution in certain circumstances. It was the inconsistency, the way she had served the other passengers without the same level of formality. As if their hands were somehow different from his. The thought lingered, uncomfortable in its clarity. He glanced around the cabin. Most passengers were engrossed in their own lives, reading books or scrolling through phones. Yet here and there, he caught the subtle signs of awareness: a sidelong glance, a furrowed brow. A couple seated nearby exchanged whispers, their voices low but their expressions unmistakable. They had noticed, too. Devon was not a man given to quick conclusions. His work had taught him the value of patience, of allowing the facts to reveal themselves in time. But he had also learned to trust his instincts, to recognize the quiet patterns that often spoke louder than words. What he felt now was not anger but a familiar sadness, the kind that comes from witnessing something so small and yet so telling. A voice behind him broke the silence. "Excuse me," a woman said, her tone firm but polite. Devon turned slightly in his seat to see a middle-aged passenger addressing Kara. "Why did you put on gloves to serve that gentleman, but not the rest of us?" Kara froze for a moment, her composure faltering just enough to reveal the discomfort beneath. "It's just a precaution," she replied, her voice clipped. "Standard procedure." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Standard? I've been flying for years, and I've never seen that before." Kara opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she nodded stiffly and moved on, her steps a little quicker now, as if hoping to escape the weight of the question. Devon watched the exchange with quiet appreciation. It was a small act, but it mattered. The woman's willingness to speak up had shifted the energy in the cabin, drawing attention to something that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Around him, other passengers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. He turned back to his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keys but unable to focus. The incident, so seemingly minor, had left a mark. It wasn't the first time he had encountered something like this, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But it was a reminder of the quiet ways in which prejudice could manifest unspoken, unacknowledged, but no less real. As the plane glided through the sky, Devon found himself thinking not of the moment itself but of the broader story it told. This was not about a single flight attendant or a pair of gloves. It was about the countless interactions, the small, seemingly insignificant moments that, when taken together, painted a much larger picture. And as the hum of the engines filled the cabin once more, Devon made a quiet decision. He would not let this go. Not yet. The flight continued, steady and uneventful to most. The hum of the engines seemed to quiet the cabin, creating an atmosphere of stillness, interrupted only by the occasional clink of a coffee cup or the shuffle of a newspaper. But beneath this surface calm, an unease had taken root, subtle yet palpable. Devon sat in his seat, his eyes no longer on his laptop but on the movements around him. Kara moved through the aisle again, her steps practiced, her posture unwavering. To the casual observer, she seemed composed, professional, focused on her duties. But Devon noticed the small changes: the tightness in her jaw, the way her hands lingered on her tray a second longer than necessary, the faint tension in her smile. He wasn't the only one who noticed. A couple seated across from him whispered quietly, their glances shifting between Kara and Devon. A man in the row behind him leaned slightly forward, as if trying to catch the details of the exchange without being obvious. The cabin, once filled with the pleasant monotony of routine, now seemed to carry an undercurrent of curiosity and discomfort. Devon found himself wondering how far the ripples of this moment would extend. The interaction had been brief, almost trivial in the grand scheme of things. A pair of gloves, a tone of voice, a glance that lingered too long or didn't linger at all. Yet these small moments, he knew, often held the weight of much larger truths. Kara approached another passenger, her tray balanced with care. The man she served smiled at her, and she returned the gesture a polite, if slightly strained, acknowledgement. No gloves this time. Devon watched, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had seen this before. It wasn't the overt kind of discrimination that drew headlines or sparked protests. It was quieter than that, woven into the fabric of everyday life, so subtle it could be dismissed with a shrug or an excuse. Around him, the whispers grew. Devon could feel the cabin shifting. The quiet tension spreading like an unspoken question passed from one row to the next. It wasn't just him anymore. Others had noticed, and though no one spoke aloud, the atmosphere had changed. A flight attendant, younger and seemingly less experienced than Kara, passed by with a quick smile for the passengers. She didn't pause at Devon's row, but he caught her glance brief, uncertain, and perhaps a little apologetic. It was a small gesture, but it stayed with him. Even here, in this microcosm of the world, there were layers of awareness and complicity, silence and action. Devon shifted in his seat, his gaze returning to Kara as she moved through the cabin. He wasn't angry, not in the way people often expected when they spoke of injustice. What he felt was something deeper, more complex, a quiet sadness mixed with resolve. He thought of the stories he'd heard over the years. The clients who had come to him not with dramatic tales of oppression, but with the slow, steady erosion of dignity that came from moments like these. Kara returned to the galley, her back straight, her movements brisk. She hadn't glanced at Devon since their earlier exchange, and he wondered if she was aware of the whispers, the glances, the subtle shift in the cabin's energy. Perhaps she was, and perhaps she wasn't. Either way, the moment had passed, but its echo remained. Devon closed his laptop, leaning back in his seat as the plane cruised through the endless sky. He thought about the quiet ways in which the world revealed itself. How much could be said in what wasn't spoken? How much could be understood in what wasn't done? This wasn't the kind of fight that made headlines or history books. It was smaller than that, quieter, but no less important. And as the cabin settled once more into its uneasy rhythm, Devon made a silent promise to himself. This, too, was worth remembering. The cabin had grown quieter as the flight progressed. The muted sounds of passengers settling into their routines blending with the ever-present hum of the engines. Some had fallen asleep, their heads resting against windows or reclining seats. Others read books or magazines, their faces calm, detached from the subtle undercurrent that lingered in the air. But Devon wasn't detached. He couldn't be. He had spent the past hour observing, not just Kara but the dynamics unfolding around him. He had watched her serve other passengers, her demeanor professional yet markedly different. The gloves appeared only for him, their absence with others like a silent admission. He had hoped to let it go, to focus on the work waiting for him on his laptop. But the weight of the moment refused to fade. It wasn't the gloves themselves, it was what they represented. The quiet, insidious way prejudice could seep into even the most ordinary interactions. Devon decided to act, not out of anger but out of principle. He reached for the call button, the small chime breaking the stillness. A flight attendant approached, not Kara, but another, younger crew member whose polite smile faltered slightly when she saw him. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" Her voice was kind but cautious, as if she sensed the tension without understanding its source. "I'd like to speak with the flight supervisor," Devon said calmly. His tone was measured, giving no hint of confrontation, only the quiet firmness of someone accustomed to addressing uncomfortable truths. The attendant nodded quickly, her steps brisk as she disappeared toward the galley. Devon sat back, his hands resting on the armrests, his gaze fixed on the aisle ahead. Around him, a few passengers stirred, their eyes flicking toward him with curiosity. The whispers, which had subsided, began again, soft but persistent. When the supervisor arrived, she introduced herself with practiced politeness. Her name tag read Melissa, and she carried the demeanor of someone accustomed to diffusing tensions mid-flight. She crouched slightly to meet Devon's eyes, her expression attentive. "Mr. Grant," she began, glancing briefly at the manifest in her hand. "I understand you've requested to speak with me. Is there something I can assist you with?" Devon nodded. "Yes. I'd like to address an issue I've noticed during this flight." He kept his voice low, his words deliberate. "When I was served earlier by one of your attendants, she wore gloves. I've since observed that this isn't standard practice for other passengers." Melissa's face remained neutral, but Devon noticed a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "I see," she said, her tone carefully measured. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll look into it." "I'd appreciate that," Devon replied, his voice steady. "I'm not here to cause a scene. But I do think it's important to acknowledge what's happened. Small actions often reflect larger attitudes, and ignoring them only allows them to persist." Melissa nodded slowly, her gaze dropping briefly before meeting his again. "I understand," she said. "Let me speak with the attendant in question, and I'll return shortly." As she walked away, Devon felt a mix of emotions: relief at having spoken up, frustration at the necessity of doing so, and a lingering sadness at the quiet persistence of these moments. He wasn't looking for an apology or an explanation. What he wanted was acknowledgement. A recognition that these subtle acts mattered, that they shaped the experiences of those subjected to them. Kara remained in the galley, her back turned as Melissa spoke to her. Their conversation was brief, their voices low, but Devon could see the tension in Kara's posture. She glanced toward the cabin once, her expression unreadable, before returning to her work. When Melissa returned, she crouched again beside Devon's seat. "I've spoken with the attendant," she said. She indicated that the gloves were part of her safety protocol. "But I'll ensure this matter is addressed fully after the flight. On behalf of Skywings, I want to apologize for any discomfort this may have caused." Devon nodded, sensing the limitations of her response. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate your willingness to address this." Melissa straightened, offering a polite smile before returning to the galley. Around him, the whispers had grown louder, a few passengers exchanging knowing looks. Devon could feel the quiet solidarity of those who had noticed, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet approval. As the plane continued its journey westward, Devon leaned back in his seat, his gaze turning once more to the window. The clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder of both the vastness of the world and the smallness of the moment. Yet, in that smallness, there was significance. It wasn't the act itself that mattered most, but the choice to name it, to refuse its silence. Devon knew this wasn't the end of the story. It rarely was, but it was a start. The plane began its gradual descent toward Los Angeles, the announcement of the approaching landing stirring passengers from their quiet routines. Seatbacks were straightened, trays folded away, and headphones removed as the cabin shifted back into wakefulness. Devon watched the activity around him, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his thoughts still on the exchange that had marked the earlier part of the flight. The matter seemed to have settled on the surface. Kara moved through the cabin with a practiced composure, attending to final tasks with the efficiency of someone determined to put the incident behind her. Yet there was an undercurrent to her movements, a tension that spoke of awareness of being watched, perhaps, or of knowing she had been called out in a way she couldn't entirely dismiss. Melissa, the flight supervisor, had not returned to Devon's seat since their conversation. He imagined she had done what she could for now, promising herself to revisit the situation in a more formal capacity once the flight was over. But Devon wasn't waiting for corporate policies or HR interventions. He understood too well how these moments often faded into bureaucracy, their edges softened by paperwork and procedure until they were all but forgotten. The silence around him felt heavy now, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath. Some passengers glanced his way occasionally, their curiosity obvious but unspoken. Others seemed deliberately indifferent, their eyes fixed on magazines or windows, as though avoiding involvement was its own kind of decision. Devon's reflection in the window stared back at him, the faint shadow of a man accustomed to bearing the weight of moments like this. It wasn't a burden he had chosen, not at first, but over the years, he had come to see it as an inevitable part of his role, not just as a lawyer or activist, but as a black man navigating a world that often refused to see him clearly. A quiet movement pulled his attention. Kara was approaching, her steps slower than before, her tray conspicuously absent. When she reached his row, she hesitated, her hands clasped in front of her. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed something else, an uncertainty, perhaps even regret. Mr. Grant, she began, her voice low, almost hesitant. I wanted to apologize for earlier. Devon studied her for a moment, his expression calm but unreadable. He had heard apologies like this before too many times. In fact, they often came with good intentions but were rarely accompanied by meaningful change. Apologies are easy, Devon said finally, his voice measured but firm. Respect takes more effort. Kara's composure faltered slightly, and she looked down, her hands tightening in front of her. For a moment, it seemed as though she might say more, but then she nodded and stepped back, retreating toward the galley. Devon watched her go, his feelings a quiet mix of empathy and disappointment. It wasn't personal, it rarely was, but that was part of the problem, wasn't it? These moments weren't about individual malice, they were about patterns. About a world that made such behaviors seem normal, even inevitable. Kara might not have intended harm, but intent was rarely the point. The impact lingered regardless. When the plane finally landed, the passengers filed out in the usual hurried procession, eager to escape the confines of the cabin. Devon took his time, letting the crowd thin before stepping into the aisle. As he moved toward the exit, he felt the weight of the moment settle more firmly on his shoulders. Melissa stood near the door, offering polite farewells to each passenger. When Devon approached, she met his gaze directly, her expression sincere but slightly strained. Thank you for bringing the matter to our attention, Mr. Grant, she said. We'll make sure it's addressed. Devon nodded, his response quiet but pointed. I hope so. Outside the plane, the terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm, people rushing to gates, announcements echoing overhead, and the distant hum of luggage wheels on polished floors. Devon paused for a moment, letting the chaos wash over him. Then, pulling out his phone, he opened the camera app and snapped a picture of the gloves still lying on his tray table, their stark presence a symbol of everything unspoken. Later, when he posted the image online, he wouldn't use words of anger or blame. Instead, he would let the image speak for itself, a quiet reminder that the smallest gestures often carried the heaviest meanings. And as the post began to circulate, as the comments and shares multiplied, Devon would reflect not on the gloves or the flight or even Kara herself, but on the deeper truth the moment revealed. This wasn't just his story. It was the story of countless others, those who had experienced these moments in silence, who had felt their dignity eroded bit by bit, day by day. Devon had spoken up because he could. But as he walked through the terminal, he couldn't help but wonder how many others still couldn't. The post was simple, a photograph of the gloves, taken from Devon's seat, accompanied by a short caption. A quiet reminder of how prejudice often looks small, silent, but deeply felt. We notice. We always notice. Devon didn't expect it to gain much traction. He had shared it more for himself than for an audience. A way to process the moment and mark it for what it was. But social media has a way of amplifying even the quietest voices. And within hours, the post began to spread. Likes turned into comments, comments into shares, and soon, the photograph was everywhere. The responses came in waves. Many expressed outrage, their words filled with indignation at the flight attendant's behavior and demands for accountability from the airline. Others shared their own stories, small, everyday moments of discrimination that mirrored Devon's experience. Each comment seemed to echo the same sentiment. This is not new. This is not rare. Devon read the responses in silence, his face calm but his mind restless. He wasn't surprised by the reaction. The story wasn't extraordinary. Not in the sense that it was uncommon. What struck him was the sheer volume of people who saw themselves in the gloves, in the quiet humiliation of being singled out for reasons they couldn't control. Skywings, the airline, issued a statement the next morning. It was short and carefully worded, apologizing for the experience described by one of our valued passengers, and promising a thorough internal review. Devon read it without much emotion. He had seen similar statements before, corporate apologies designed to placate rather than address. What did catch his attention, however, was the email from the airline's public relations team, offering to discuss the matter further. Devon hesitated before replying. He had no desire for a private apology or a token gesture of goodwill. If the airline wanted to engage, it would have to be on terms that extended beyond him. By the afternoon, news outlets had picked up the story. A headline in one national paper read, "Flight gloves spark debate on everyday racism." Devon's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, requests for interviews, and messages from colleagues and acquaintances. Most were supportive, though a few advised caution, warning him of the potential backlash. Devon agreed to one interview, a quiet conversation with a journalist he respected. The piece was published that evening, and it captured his perspective with the kind of nuance often missing in stories like these. "This isn't about the gloves," he had said during the interview. "It's about the message they send. It's about how people internalize these small moments, how they carry them, how they shape the way we move through the world. I've spent my life advocating for systemic change, but it's these day-to-day interactions that remind me why the work matters." The article struck a chord, and the post continued to grow. What had started as a single image became a focal point for a broader conversation about subtle discrimination, the kind that doesn't make headlines but leaves scars all the same. People debated, argued, shared their perspectives. The gloves had become a symbol, both of what was wrong and of the possibility for change. The airline's CEO reached out to Devon directly 2 days later. Their conversation was polite but firm on Devon's part. He outlined his expectations: transparency about the investigation, meaningful consequences for those involved, and a commitment to addressing the deeper issues through training and policy changes. The CEO assured him these steps would be taken. But Devon reserved judgment. Promises were easy, follow-through was harder. As the week unfolded, Devon reflected on the whirlwind that had followed such a quiet moment on the plane. He thought about the passengers who had whispered among themselves, the woman who had spoken up, the supervisor who had offered an apology she couldn't quite make her own. Each had played a role, intentional or not, in the way the story unfolded. More than anything, though, he thought about those who hadn't been on the plane, those who had read his post and seen themselves in it. Their stories, shared in comments and private messages, stayed with him. Each one was a reminder that the fight wasn't just his. And it certainly wasn't over. As he prepared for a television interview later that evening, Devon sat in his quiet apartment, the city's sounds muffled by the windows. His phone buzzed again, a message from an old friend, thanking him for speaking up. Devon stared at the screen for a moment, then typed a short reply. "Sometimes it's the small moments that matter most. We just have to make sure they're not forgotten." And as the light faded outside, Devon made his way to the studio, knowing the conversation was just beginning. In the days that followed, the story continued to ripple outward, reaching places Devon hadn't anticipated. Friends from his past reached out, their messages a mix of encouragement and reflection. Some shared their own quiet stories of being overlooked, judged, or dismissed. Others simply thanked him, their words carrying the weight of gratitude often reserved for those who speak aloud what others cannot. Skywings released another statement, this time with more specifics. The airline acknowledged the incident and announced that Kara, the flight attendant, had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. They also committed to launching a comprehensive anti-discrimination training program for all employees. The language was polished, the promises well-crafted, but Devon read it with the skepticism born of experience. He wasn't looking for punitive measures or empty gestures. He wanted more than apologies, he wanted change, real, measurable change that reached beyond corporate statements and social media hashtags. It wasn't about Kara as an individual, though her actions had triggered the moment. It was about the systems, the cultures, the quiet ways in which bias was allowed to persist unchecked. Invitations began to arrive, panels, discussions, television appearances. Devon accepted a few, carefully choosing the platforms where he believed the conversation could go deeper. In one interview, he spoke about the subtle nature of discrimination, how it often hides in plain sight. It's not always about grand acts of hatred. He said. More often, it's in the small things, the hesitations, the assumptions, the moments when someone decides, consciously or not, that you are less worthy of dignity. Those moments add up. They shape the way we see ourselves and the way the world sees us. The interviewer nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you think the airline's response is enough? She asked. Devon paused, considering his words carefully. It's a start, he said, but change isn't about one incident or one company. It's about how we as a society choose to respond when these moments happen. Do we brush them aside? Do we justify them? Or do we confront them? Even when it's uncomfortable? The response to his words was immediate and overwhelming. Emails and letters arrived, many from older individuals who shared a sense of recognition in Devon's story. They wrote about years spent enduring similar slights, the accumulation of small wounds that had shaped their lives in ways they were only now beginning to understand. One letter stood out to him, a handwritten note from a woman in her 70s. She described an incident from her youth, when she had been refused service at a diner in the South. The pain of that moment had stayed with her. She wrote, not because it was the worst thing that had ever happened to her, but because it was so ordinary, so accepted by those around her. You reminded me, the letter concluded, that those moments matter. Even now, so many years later, they matter. Devon read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on his desk. It wasn't the only message that moved him, but it captured something essential: the way these moments, though small, had a way of lingering, shaping not just the past but the present. Skywings followed through on some of their promises. They invited Devon to consult on their new training program, and while he declined a formal role, he offered suggestions for ensuring the initiative went beyond surface-level fixes. He spoke with the CEO once more, this time over a video call, where they discussed not just the incident but the broader cultural shifts needed in the airline industry and beyond. I appreciate your willingness to engage, Devon said near the end of the call. But remember, this can't just be about what looks good on paper. It has to be about the people who experience these moments every day. If you lose sight of that, all of this will be meaningless. The CEO nodded, her expression serious. We won't lose sight of it, she promised. We can't afford to. As the call ended, Devon felt a cautious sense of hope. He had learned not to expect too much too quickly, but he also knew that progress, however incremental, was worth pursuing. That evening, he posted another message online. It wasn't about the airline or Kara or even the gloves. Instead, it was a reflection on the power of acknowledgement. No prejudice is too small to challenge. He wrote, it's in the smallest moments that we find the clearest reflection of who we are and who we want to be. The post resonated with thousands, sparking new conversations and drawing more attention to the subtle ways bias manifests in everyday life. For Devon, it was a reminder that even the quietest voices, when heard, could create something larger than themselves. And as he sat in his apartment, reading through the latest wave of messages, he felt the weight of the moment settle into something steadier, not a burden, but a purpose. The days turned into weeks, and while the initial intensity of the story began to fade, its echoes lingered. Devon found himself reflecting not on the flight itself, but on what it revealed about the world he lived in, a world where small gestures, seemingly inconsequential, carried the weight of generations. The post had done its work, sparking conversations and forcing institutions like Skywings to confront uncomfortable truths. The airline continued to roll out its promised initiatives, sharing updates about employee training and policy changes. Devon remained cautiously optimistic. He knew real change wouldn't come quickly, but it was a step forward, a small dent in a system that had long resisted reckoning. Invitations to speak kept coming, and Devon accepted some, declining others. He had no interest in becoming the face of a single incident. Instead, he focused on what the story had revealed, the quiet persistence of everyday bias and the power of collective awareness. In one of his speeches, delivered to a group of college students, he described it as the weight of small things. It's easy to focus on the obvious, he told the audience, the overt acts of racism, the headlines that demand outrage. But what shapes us, what lingers, are the moments that don't make the news. The cashier who avoids your eyes, the The neighbor who doesn't wave back. The flight attendant who wears gloves for you and no one else. These moments are quiet, but they accumulate, and in their silence, they carry tremendous weight. The students listened intently, their faces a mix of understanding and determination. For many of them, this wasn't new information, it was a confirmation of what they already knew but hadn't always been able to articulate. For Devon, it was a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. Advocacy wasn't just about policy or lawsuits, it was about illuminating the patterns that often went unnoticed. Helping others see the connections between individual actions and collective systems. At home, Devon returned to his writing. The incident had sparked an idea for a new book, one that explored the quiet ways in which prejudice shaped lives. He began with a chapter titled The Gloves, using the flight as an entry point into a larger discussion about subtle discrimination. The words came slowly at first, but as he wrote, he found a rhythm, weaving in stories from his own life and the countless experiences shared with him over the years. The letters continued to arrive, many from older individuals who saw themselves in Devon's story. One man wrote about working in a factory in the 1960s, where he was told to use a separate lunchroom, for hygiene reasons. A woman shared a memory of being overlooked for a promotion because her demeanor didn't fit the company culture. These stories weren't new, but they were powerful in their specificity, each one a testament to the endurance of dignity in the face of quiet exclusion. Devon wrote back to as many as he could. His responses thoughtful and personal. He knew the value of acknowledgement, of letting people know they had been heard. It was a small act, but it mattered. As the months passed, the story of the gloves faded from the public eye, replaced by new headlines and fresh outrages. But for Devon, it remained a touchstone, a reminder of how much work remained. He thought often of Kara, wondering what had become of her. Had she learned from the experience? Had it forced her to reflect, to question her own assumptions? He hoped so, though he knew he might never find out. One evening, as he prepared to step onto another stage for another panel discussion, Devon paused backstage, looking out at the audience. Most of them were older, faces lined with years of experience, their eyes carrying the weight of lives lived in a country that had often been slow to change. He thought of the stories they carried, the quiet moments that had shaped them, for better or worse. When he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Devon took a deep breath and began. "This is not a story about a pair of gloves," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "It's a story about the world we've built and the world we want to leave behind. It's about the small choices we make, everyday choices that tell people who they are and who we think they should be." The audience leaned in, their attention unwavering. Devon continued, his words steady but insistent. "We can't change the past, but we can choose to see the present clearly. We can choose to name the things we've ignored, to confront the quiet injustices we've allowed to persist. And in doing so, we can begin to build something better." When he finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. Devon didn't smile, but he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The work was never finished, but moments like this reminded him why it mattered. Later, as he walked to his car under the glow of the city lights, Devon thought about the words he had written weeks ago. No prejudice is too small to challenge. He still believed that, and as he looked out at the world around him, vast and imperfect, he knew he always would.